Welcome back, everyone, to History of the Meta, a YouTube-exclusive series by SuperMagicalCup where we review past metas, past balance changes to talk about the Clash Royale that was. Yes. Today we are talking about the February 19th balance update. This was the last balance update of beta. The very next update was the global launch patch, so this is Supercell's one of their last attempts to sort of twist the knobs and tweak the levers to get the game to the point that they wanted to get it in before showing it to a wider audience. So make sure to subscribe to YouTube and follow the rest of the series as well as all of our other YouTube videos. And make sure definitely to check us out on twitch.tv/SuperMagicalCup. Every Saturday at noon Pacific, we have the best Clash Royale tournament in the community featuring the best players playing for the most prestigious prize.
Absolutely. Special thanks to Galadon, Clash with Ash, and Gaming with Molt for providing us with their footage of Clash Royale in the time zone of February 19th.
Yeah, the ancient days of February, mid-Feb. Oh, just past Valentine's Day.
All right, let's get into it.
So before we get into the balance changes, it's worthwhile talking about what the meta was like that led to these balance changes coming in. They may not make sense unless you sort of understood what was happening in the game at the time. The thing that I remember the most from this time period was that towers across the board were incredibly strong, like maybe overpowered, right? It was pretty common to see most decks playing 2 defensive buildings, and it wasn't unheard of to see 3 or even 4 defensive buildings in a single deck. The most popular archetypes were Mortar, or even something like Rocket Cycle, where you would just play like 3 towers, 3 spells, and just some junky troops to like cycle, basically, and you would just sit behind your 60-second long defensive towers and fire rockets at the opponent's base. Cards like Tombstone were all over the place, Tesla Tower, Cannon, Inferno Tower. Not so much Bomb Tower, but like pretty much every defensive structure was played. Beatdown decks were not very popular at all. Hog Freeze was kind of popular, but in the last update, Freeze got a big nerf. So what was popular in this update was Hog Lightning. You'd play the Hog Rider not at the river, but behind your King Tower and save the elixir back up. And when you got across the river and your opponent was like Musketeer Cannon or something, you'd have to lightning the whole thing to get any damage through. Giant was not played. Royal Giant didn't exist yet. So the most commonly played tank was actually Golem. Golem was very popular, but not so much any of the other tanks because everything else didn't have enough hit points to get through these tower jungles.
So after I kind of looked through a lot of the clips and tried to see, what the gameplay was like during that time through recordings that were generously provided to us by Galadon and such, it was actually interesting to me. A lot of the decks included both these cards, Barbarians and Minion Horde. And to me, I mean, looking at the game as it is now, that initially sounds like a very, very expensive set of cards to pick.
Slugfest.
Yeah. So you said the word perfectly. The meta seemed kind of slugfesty. There were a lot of 5+ cards, really expensive stuff.
Yeah, Wizard, Bard. Yeah. That was like the main defensive cards you would play.
Yeah. And so it was just interesting to me to see that happen. And cycle decks really didn't exist yet. You talked about Hog Freeze and Hog Lightning, and Barbarians, Minion Horde, Wizard were included in those decks, and that's definitely not a Hog Cycle type thing that you would see.
Absolutely.
Hog Cycle is very cheap. They keep cards down to like 2 or 3 costs at the most, maybe 4, but 5 elixir and 2 of them not seen very often. And I think there are some reasons to think about this. We talked about it a little bit, him and I, and at this time, Zap wasn't the card that it is now.
Didn't stun, yeah.
And 2 cards that did not exist that are staples of Clash Royale gameplay now, the Princess and the Ice Wizard, did not exist at this time. Cheap, available splash options that can take down Minion Hordes and Barbarians very easily and very efficiently, not really in the meta, and so I think that's really one of the reasons why these cards are very used. Yeah. The other part of that too is that the Musketeer wasn't really that great either.
Right, like there was actually all the best cards in the game cost 5 or 6 or more. Yeah. And this is, in a time before Ice Wizard, Princess, Fire Spirit, Ice Spirit, playable zaps, you know what I mean? Like there wasn't really enough cards to make a good cycle deck, and I don't think the player base was really caught on to that yet.
Yeah.
So the community was really starting to grasp the basic mechanics of the game by now. The game had been out for just a little over a month, so you started to see videos coming out on YouTube that were like the basics of Elixir management. I wrote my first Reddit article that was like, Elixir advantage, did you know how this works? You know what I mean? People were just starting to wrap their heads around the basic mechanics of the game and how to make it work. Even just some things like, don't play anything until you've saved up to 10 Elixir. Like, there's no reason to play something until you're at 10 Elixir. That kind of stuff was not really widespread at the time, but people were catching on to it pretty quick. So with all that said, that's the world we lived in before the balance update. Let's get into those balance patch notes. So the game was really grindy and defensive at this time, and this is the first time that Supercell openly came out and said, you know what, offense over defense. Like, we're gonna make every change from here on out with the idea that offense should be more powerful than defense. And nothing was more defensive than the spell cycle decks that were popular around this time. I think they originated in the Eastern meta. It was one of those things where if you were up late at night, you would play against like Chinese players, and they would have it. They were really good. I mean, this was a very StarCrafty sort of, you know, like, I'm gonna beat you the most technical way I can. The decks were usually like 3 defensive towers, like for example, Tesla, Cannon, Bomb Tower, right? A Tesla Cannon and Inferno, maybe. 3 spells, so like arrows, fireball, rocket, and then just any troops, like Knight maybe, because it cycles and has some hit points, just anything like that, skeletons, whatever, like cheap troops to block spells and defensive towers. And there was a really weird synergy between these cards because if I play a 60-second long defensive tower, your first thought might be like, oh, I'll put stuff behind the King Tower in order to build up a big push. Well, great, I can rocket your tower and the troops now. I can fireball your tower and the troops. So there was this really negative like interaction between long health defensive towers and very powerful spells because they just complement each other so well. The first change they made was reducing the damage of all spells by 20% against crown towers. Spells used to do 50% of their damage to crown towers, so a 1,000 damage rocket would do 500 damage. After this nerf, they only did 40% damage to towers, so that 1,000 damage rocket would do 400 damage. Yeah. Well, that's significant over the course of, you know, I'm casting 6 rockets over the course of a game. It went from being like, oh yeah, I got it, to like, no, actually you're like 700 damage short, right? Like, so
which is a big difference.
That's a very important difference, especially when those decks were still winning by like the skin of their teeth. It was just, you know, whatever. They did a lot of changes in this patch that were offense over defense, but I think no change was as wide, as sweeping, and as impactful as reducing spell damage against crown towers.
The next few changes continue with Supercell's stated philosophy of offense over defense, and the 2 big changes are going to come in the form of Tombstone and Inferno Tower. Now the Tombstone, much like many of the other tower nerfs that are coming during this time, is taken from 60-second duration down to 40 seconds, which is a very significant change, right?
Yeah.
When the Tombstone is pumping out a skeleton every 3 seconds, 60 seconds of that is so many skeletons, and just cutting down 20 seconds of its lifetime really reduces its effectiveness. And like a Tombstone, right? If you imagine a mini P.E.K.K.A coming down your lane against a Tombstone, you have so many skeletons that you have to fight through, and then you can start stacking tombstones on top of each other with a 60-second duration quite easily.
Oh yeah, I mean, I would say Tombstone was so popular right now. It was one of the things that was good against the Hog Riders, right? It would distract them towards the middle, but I would say Tombstone's popularity single-handedly kept Mini P.E.K.K.A, P.E.K.K.A, Prince out of the meta. Like, all of those cards were not nearly as popular as they are later in Clash Royale's lifetime, almost solely because of how popular Tombstone was.
Absolutely. So about a 33% reduction in production, mathematically, for the Tombstone, duration reduced. So the second change is going to be the Inferno Tower, and it got nerfed in a big way. The Inferno Tower originally was one of the most popular defensive structures you would ever play, just pretty much a staple in most decks, but it got its health points reduced, and then it also got its lifetime brought down to 40 seconds, again from piggybacking off of their earlier change, which is from 60 to 45, now even further to 40. And I think after this point, this was about when Inferno Tower kind of got kicked out of the running, and Tesla kind of rose to popularity.
Yeah, if you remember in the last update, Tesla got a huge buff, and people were already starting to play Tesla as one of their 2 or 3 defensive buildings. Yeah. But once Inferno Tower took this nerf, it really fell out of the metagame, and I distinctly remember the 2 weeks after this balance update until the next balance update when Tesla gets nerfed again, that everyone played Tesla. Like, Tesla was the most common. You hated that card more than any other card. It was so good, and there was nowhere to really play around it because it was just really good, really efficient for its cost.
Yeah. Keep in mind when we talked about how the towers were kind of, it was basically like watching a game of baseball, right? Each of the towers were next up to bat, and Supercell really slowly and painfully kind of nerfed them one by one before
Yeah.
they finally decided, like, actually, all the towers are kind of really strong.
Yeah, it wasn't that Inferno Tower was overpowered, it's that every tower was overpowered, and Inferno was just the best of them. So Inferno went away, everyone plays Tesla, and if you keep watching the series, you'll see that like they nerfed Tesla, and the very next thing is like, oh, Bomb Tower, and then eventually they have to like, oh no, Bomb Tower, get down here. And then they nerfed Cannon like 5 times in a row. So yeah, defensive towers were really, really strong in the beta of Clash Royale. As a fun little like side note, the reason why was that late into development, towers did not have a lifespan. They just lived forever, right? Because that makes sense, right? Buildings don't die on their own. Yeah. And it was only kind of late in the game that they added a lifetime to it. And I think the lifetime was just a little too long on all the towers early on. The next 2 changes are little tweaks that happened to cards that have been recently reworked. If you remember in the last update, Musketeer was reduced from 5 elixir down to 4 elixir. Now Musketeer was not used at 5 elixir hardly at all because Wizard was so good. They simultaneously nerfed Wizard and reduced Musketeer's cost, thinking like, oh, now it has a place in the game. The problem was they way reduced the damage more than they should have on the Musketeer. Now, once you factor in this damage increase after the cost reduction and damage reduction, Musketeer now at 4 elixir had a higher damage per elixir cost than it did when it was at 5. So after these 2 changes, both making it cheaper and then making it more efficient than it used to be, Musketeer very quickly finds its place in the metagame as a very balanced card. It doesn't, at the time of recording this in August, it hasn't been changed since. So as of mid-February, right before global launch, Musketeer became sort of the most balanced ranged attacker that everything else is sort of balanced around.
And it's kind of interesting too because as of recording this video, Musketeer still is kind of the only card that fulfills its role in the way that it does, as kind of a 4-cost, spell-resistant ranged damage dealer, really.
Yeah. It's the only single target damage dealer that costs 4 or less and survives fireballs and poisons and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, that was a great change to Musketeer. The other change was to Golem and Golemite. Now we talked over the last few videos, if you've been watching, that Golem was really good, but it took a while for people to discover it because again, this is only a month into the game. Not that many people are in Arena 6, and the ones that are may not have collected Arena 6 epics enough to catch up to their other cards. So Golem was like a slowly discovered thing. The last update changed it so that the Golem had way more hit points and the Golemites had significantly less hit points to kind of separate the power level between the two. Now this ended up being kind of a lateral change. It didn't really raise or lower the power of Golem, so Golem continues to be very, very popular. This hit point nerf was designed to pull the Golem back a little bit, but what's funny is that Golem actually became more powerful after this update because Inferno Tower went away, right? When Inferno Tower quit being played, Tesla's good, but it's not strong enough to knock down a Golem and the Golemite. So after this patch, Golem continues to be very popular, although I think you start to see more uses of the other tanks as well.
Finally, for the last 2 changes for the February 19th patch, Supercell addressed skeletons and also the witch. Now let's start with the skeletons. This is a big change. I mean, skeletons in many ways are kind of the heart and soul of chump units. They define chump units, right? So 1 elixir cost cards, I think, just in terms of gameplay and mechanics and core gameplay mechanics, players hadn't really figured out the best ways to use the skeletons. And in fact, Rumham and I took a look, and there's this orange juice video that came out.
It took a while for people to transition after this update from Tombstone to Skeletons, but about a month after this update goes live, Orange Juice releases a video, one of his first big videos called Advanced Tech, How to Use Skeletons. Supercell loved the video. They promoted it in-app so you could click and go watch it. Like 1 million people watched this video, and immediately after that, people started realizing that where you used to play Tombstone, you would just play the 1 elixir skeletons. And then from that, to the earlier point about cycle decks, once people started playing 1 elixir skeletons, I think they started realizing like, oh wow, it's really easy to get back to my elixir collector. It's really easy to get back to my hog rider. And this change that drifted people away from Tombstone into skeletons also really birthed the cycle decks. It made people realize the power of cycling through your deck faster than your opponent. So a lot of weird residual effects came out of this Tombstone nerf and then the skeleton buff.
So moving down to the witch, and it's kind of interesting because I'm trying to remember, and we'll probably see further down the line, but every time they change witch, they also change skeletons.
Not every time, but you're right, they went together a lot.
They're pretty they're pretty connected, and that's because the witch makes skeletons, of course. Sure. But they give, and I wish we had confetti, some another one in the addition of useless witch buff.
Yeah, this is like, there's a half dozen witch buffs that don't do anything. Like, this change is both last and least. You know, like a 3% damage increase. It was like, witch was not that close to being played, and the 3% damage increase didn't do much. I would say it continues to be a big struggle.
Which is kind of an interesting card to me since we've been doing these meta timelines, because in the very first update, when we talked about kind of Supercell's initial kind of knee-jerk reaction balance patch before they really made a concerted effort to make sure they were carefully curating what they would change and what they would not change, I think Witch is the biggest kind of victim of that knee-jerk reaction, because it took a big hit to start out. I think it was something like a...
Very first episode.
Yeah.
Very first balance patch, they reduced the level of the skeletons that the Witch made, but then in this update, they increased the power of all skeletons by like a level's worth, right?
Yeah,
so it's
yeah.
like Witch kind of got the rope-a-dope there where they
Yeah.
nerfed it, and then like this skeleton buff just brought Witch back to where she was, which shows that maybe she wasn't broken in the first place.
Yeah. And so we'll see that the Witch gets many, many more changes, and as of recording this, I mean, it's gotten to a slightly better place where people are like, maybe, but it's still not very played.
Yeah. So that wraps it up for History of the Meta number 5. Make sure to subscribe on YouTube, check us out on Twitch, watch the rest of the series, and of course, leave a comment below letting us know your favorite memories from this time period, what you liked and didn't like from this video, and what we should be doing in future iterations of this series.
All right, see you guys.